What's up guys, Agent here again, another build video, and today we're going to be discussing the Dragonknight tank. This build is known as what I would like to call the Bastion. It's more of a solo sustain build, so you're not really going to be using this build if you're with the group kind of tanking the boss while the group is behind you or in front of you, kind of dealing damage. This is more in those cases where you're going to have to tank a couple of adds by yourself, or you're going to have to tank a boss by yourself. So a couple of examples of when you might use this build are going to be Dragonstar Arena, the last boss. If you're the off tank for in Sanctum Ophidia, where you have to tank the adds against Ozara, or do the Serpent, not the Serpent, the Manticora against the Serpent. Those are kind of the examples when you would want to use this build. So it's not really focused too much on group utility, it's more about increasing your own survivability. So that way you aren't going to die. So that's kind of the focus behind this build here. Like our other builds, we'll be going over gear, our skill bars, our CP point distributions, our race attribute foods, things like that. Won't really be talking about a rotation because tanks don't really have a rotation to speak of. Instead, I will be kind of focusing in on the kind of methods that I use to stay alive while I'm using this build. Kind of talk about what I want to prioritize and kind of when I use certain skills, because when you are solo sustaining, kind of timing out when you're using certain abilities can make or break your run. So we'll talk about that towards the end of this video. So starting things off here with gear, I use Bloodspawn. This is for the ultimate regen, so whenever you take damage you have a 6% chance to generate 14 ultimate, and it gives you a nice boost to your resistances as well every 6 seconds. Not seem like a very high proc chance, but because of the amount of damage you're taking, you will typically have this activate fairly often, so this is kind of a nice set to have here. So I have 2-piece Bloodspawn. You do have several other options though. You can go with, I believe, a Sentinel of Rakugams, which will restore stamina to you, so that's a very nice source of additional sustain. You can go with Earthgore, which will give you a nice burst heal if you manage to heal yourself while you're under 50% health. Let me see if I have those sets here. Okay. So we do have an Earthgore set, so you can see here when you heal a friendly target that's under 50% health, you basically have a very large burst heal here, so you can see here it's almost 29,000. It'll be, I believe it's 30,000 when you gold it out. Plus it basically acts like a mini Purge. It removes one status effect immediately, so that's very strong. It does have a very long proc time, but when it does proc, it can help you out here. So let me see if I have Sentinel of Rakugams. Okay, I don't have Sentinel of Rakugams, but I might have... Okay, so Engine Guardian is another potential set you can use to self-sustain. When you use an ability, you have 10% chance to summon a Dwemer Automaton, I guess Automaton really, to restore X amount of health, stamina, or magic every half second for 6.5 seconds. I personally don't like Engine Guardians because it's very likely that you will get the proc that you don't need. So for example, let's say you have almost full stores of Magicka and you get the Magicka proc off of Engine Guardian. That's not going to be very useful for you. So that's why I really don't like using Engine Guardian. You're kind of playing the RNG factor a little bit too much here, so I'd rather go with something more consistent. Finally, there are a couple of other options. Let's see, do I have any Pirate? No. Pirate Skeleton's another option you can use because it does give you, I believe it's major protection. On the flip side though, it does act as a double-edged sword because it also gives you, I think it's Major Defile, which reduces the amount of healing you do to yourself. So that's something you're going to want to consider. So that's another option you can also go with. Let me see if I have Chudon. No, I do not have Mighty Chudon, but Chudon is another option here. Chudon is really just there for the additional resistances. It also free up a skill slot for you, so you don't have to use Hardened Armor in order to get your major resistances buffs. So Chudon's another potential option there. But I like to stick with Bloodspawn for that ultimate regen because we will be kind of reliant on our ultimates in order to help out our sustain. So for our first 5-piece set, we're going with Plague Doctors. Plague Doctors is a very, very selfish set because it just gives you a ton of health, but that's what we're shooting for. We're shooting for selfish, so we want to have as much health as we possibly can. So that's why we're using Plague Doctor as our first set here. Now for our second set, I'm going with Akaviri Dragonguard. Akaviri Dragonguard basically reduces the cost of our ultimate abilities, which is very, very useful, so we will be able to get Magma armor a lot faster. We'll be able to get our one-handed ultimate a lot faster. So one thing to also make note of is even though it reduces the cost of our ultimates by 15%, you still get the same amount of resources back as if you had to use it without that cost reduction. So for example, Magma Shell will cause 170 ultimate, but when you use it, you get the same amount of resources back as if you had the original ultimate cost, which is 200. So it reduces the cost of your ultimate, but it doesn't reduce the amount of resources you get back from Battle Roar as a DK tank. So that's why I like to use Dragonguard. It just helps us get our ultimates a lot faster, and Magma Armor is going to be one of our primary sources of resource return, as well as sustain in terms of health sustaining. You can go with either Dragon or Plague Doctor rings, doesn't really matter which one. If you're going to go with jewelry and you don't have access to gold jewelry, then I would say stick with necklace Akaviri Dragonguard instead, because the 5-piece isn't impacted by the quality of the items themselves, so you can go with purple jewelry and still get that 15% cost reduction. As compared to Plague, where you will see a little bit a small drop in your health if you have purple jewelry instead of gold jewelry. So that's kind of what I would recommend doing here. Now you do have a couple of other options here when it comes to sets. You can go with something like Fortified Brass, which is very, very big on resistances, so it gives you a very, very huge resistance buff, so you don't necessarily need to run hardened armor instead. You could go with what's the other set that I'm thinking of here? I think it's Bloodthorn, where whenever you deal direct damage you restore, let me see if I have it actually. Okay, so I don't have Bloodthorn. Let me see if there's a space. Okay, so I don't have Bloodthorn, but that's another option there. You can go with Hisbark, which is another crafted set, which basically gives you major evasion whenever you're blocking. So you basically are avoiding about 1 out of every 10 attacks, which could help you out there. But ultimately, in my opinion, you're definitely going to want to have Plague Doctor, and then you can play around with that second set however you'd like. Some people like Fortified Brass, other people like Hisbark. I personally like Akaviri Dragonguard, again, for the quicker and cheaper ultimates. Now for our weapons here, so you're going to go with one-handed shield on both bars, so you might see some tanks use running staffs on your back bar. I don't recommend doing that if you're going for solo sustain, because you don't have that same amount of blocking strength on your back bar if you have a staff back bar. So just stick with sword and board on both bars if you are going with a solo sustain build. For our front bar, we have an Infused Weakening enchant. This just helps reduce the amount of damage that you're taking by having that weakening enchant placed on the enemy, so that's really helpful to have that there. And then for your back bar, again, Infused. I have a Crusher enchant, but you can go with another weakening enchant, or you can go with something like Absorb Health or Absorb Stamina or something like that to help out your sustain. It's kind of up to you how you want to play around with it. I have a Crusher enchant just because sometimes I won't necessarily be some fights you won't have to solo sustain the entire time, so that's kind of why I have the Crusher there. So I'm still contributing a little bit here and there if I'm during ad pulls, if I'm keeping this build between ad pulls, boss fights. Now for armor traits and jewelry traits, you do have a couple of options here. I like to go with Infused on all of my large pieces, so that would be, head, chest, and legs. I infuse with a Prismatic Enchants. I have Divines on my Monster Helm, and that's just because I don't have Infused and I don't want to transmute. I prefer to use my crystals on weapons instead of armor, but I would normally have an Infused head here with the Prismatic Enchant. For small pieces, again, my shoulder here is Divines because I don't RNG has not given me a sturdy shoulder yet, but I would use a sturdy instead with all health enchants. Now I do have a stamina enchant here, and that's just because I'm a dark elf, so I do have to kind of play around with my stamina pools in order to make sure my stamina is higher than my magicka. So whenever I use orbs or shards, I do get stamina back instead of magicka. Dark elves do have a little bit more magicka than other races, so that's something that it's really more unique to me, and not necessarily going to be something that you're going to be using if you're, for example, an Imperial or a Red Guard. Now for our jewelry enchants, we're going with 3 shield plate enchants. Even though they did nerf the effect of shield plate, it's still going to be very, very strong, and it's going to be very, very useful to reduce the cost of block. Now some people might want to use 2 shield plate with 1 reduced feat cost, so that's reduce the stamina cost of your abilities. That's kind of up to you how you want to do with that. Both of them are pretty strong. It all depends on how often you're using your taunt and heroic slash, so that's something you're going to want to consider. I just like to have 3 shield play because when you're solo sustaining, more often than not, you're just taunting whenever you need to, or whenever the ads you are facing off against might be running away from you, so you're not necessarily going to be taunting all the time. So I don't really see the reduced feed cost being very powerful here, but you will definitely be blocking almost 90% of the time if you're solo sustaining, so that's why I prefer having 3 shield plate enchants here. Now for our shields, you kind of have a few options here for traits. You can go with Sturdy, like I have here. You can go with Infused. You can go with Reinforced, nirnhoned, or Divines. I mean, it's kind of up to you how you want to do with it. I would probably recommend, out of all of those traits, I would recommend Sturdy first, just because of the changes in block cost. And then nirnhoned and Reinforced are going to be their second best options here. Keep up with the Prismatic enchants. Do keep in mind if you're using Infused on your shields, ideally you have it on both shields, so that way you have equal resource pools across both bars, but it's not that big of a concern necessarily. Let's go over a character sheet here. I am a Dark Elf, so that's not necessarily the meta race for tanking, but Dark Elves are a nice class, a nice race to tank with. Race is not quite as important for tanking as it is for things like DPS. For support roles, it's more about knowing the fights, knowing the mechanics, and knowing how to play your role. So race doesn't really matter. If you do want to min-max though, typically speaking, Argonians are going to be considered the best race because they have additional healing received, they have additional health, have a little bit of max magicka, which helps out a little bit for your buffs. And they have a potion passive which restores all 3 of your resource pools whenever you drink a potion, so Argonians are pretty strong when it comes to tanking. Other options include Red Guards. They have max stamina and some pretty good stamina return whenever you deal damage with a melee attack. Imperials, if you have access to the Imperial Edition upgrade. Imperials are a very, very good tanking race there. You get max stamina and max health, plus you get some additional health whenever you deal damage with a melee attack, so Imperials are also very, very strong. But like I said, you can realistically tank with any race in the game. Obviously some races are going to be a little bit better than others, and depending on the race and your racial passives, you might need to play around with the attributes a little bit more. For example, in Ultima, which has only max magicka and no max stamina, you're going to need to it's basically going to be a given that you're going to have to play around a little bit with your stamina enchants, or put points into stamina in order to kind of make up for that deficit in your stamina pool. For my attributes, I have 60 points into health and 4 into stamina, and the 4 points into stamina is just kind of there to maintain my stamina pool higher than my magicka pool. Again, I am a Dark Elf, so I have 9% additional magicka and 6% additional stamina, so I do need to play around a little bit in order to get my stamina higher than my magicka across all of my different tanking setups here. So that's why I have 4 points into stamina. The general rule is you want to put as many points as you can into health while maintaining your stamina pool being higher than your magicka pool. So for an example, if you're an Imperial, then you could pretty much put all your points into health because you do have that 10% additional stamina from your racial passives. But if you're tanking on, for example, an Ultimate, a High Elf, or let's say you're tanking on a Breton who only have max magicka boost, you might need to put, let's say, 54 points into health and put the other 10 points into stamina in order to get your stamina pools higher than your magicka pools. That's something that you're going to want to play around with, and it's going to be unique to each player. I don't have food on, so let me put on food real quick so you guys get an idea of what your resource pools look like when you have food on with this build. So you can see here 46.5k health almost, 18k magicka, 18.8k stamina. So that's kind of what I have for my build. Of course, this is going to vary depending on if you're an Imperial or if you have different enchants and if you have different attribute distributions. We are a vampire for that additional passive, so you get 10% additional magicka and stamina regen. You take a little bit less damage when you're below 50% health. The downside is, of course, you take more damage from fire, so just be mindful of that. For our Mundustone, we're going with the Atronach, which boosts our magicka regen. All of our buffs pretty much are magicka skills. They use magicka in order to be activated, so that's why we have the Atronach, so we have additional magicka regen. You can see here we're sitting at about 1200 magicka regen, so that's pretty good. So that's also the reason why I have Divines to help out my magicka regen a little bit here. And for our food, we are going with Tri-Food, so we're going with purple food that boosts max health, max magicka, max stamina. That's pretty much the go-to for tanks here. Now we're going to go over our skill bars. You have several flex spots in this build, much like all other tanking setups, the other tanking setup that I have, for example, Centurion. For our front bar, we have Pierce Armor, the Taunt, Heroic Slash, Igneous Shields. All these three skills are going to be staples. You pretty much need to have them on at least one of your bars. Balance, this is kind of a flex spot. Absorb Magic is another staple skill that you must have. And Magma Shell is a huge staple. You must have this on one of your bars here. Balance is here. Balance, you're going to need to want to use this very, very wisely. So I'll talk about this a little bit more when we finish discussing our CP point distributions. But balance, basically you sacrifice health for Magicka, so you're going to want to be very careful when you decide to use balance. This is kind of a flex spot. You can trade this out for other skills, and I'll talk about what flex skills you can put in your flex spots after we go over the back bar. For our back bar, we have the Range, Taunt, Inner Rage, Green Dragonblood. These two are pretty much must-haves on one of your bars. Vigor is an additional self-heal. This is a flex spot. You don't need to use Vigor. Hardened Armor. I like to have Hardened Armor, even though you do get your major resistance buffs from Balance. I like to have Hardened Armor because you do get a little bit of a damage shield when you first activate it, so that's very helpful. An Efficient Purge. Again, this is a flex spot. This is here mainly for the 10% additional Magicka regen from Magicka Aid, but this is going to be a flex spot. Then I have Shield Wall here. I don't have it morphed, but mainly because you can go with either morph here. You can go with Spell Wall or Shield Discipline. It's kind of up to you. If you're going up, I would probably recommend going Shield Discipline instead of Shield Wall or Spell Wall. Just because if you have Shield Discipline up, you're basically able to spam your Pierce Armor, Heroic Slash, and Absorb Magic. So for example, if you're in DSA and you use Shield Discipline, you can pretty much spam Absorb Magic and basically take a ton of heals from the Magicka bosses that you are tanking. So I'd recommend going with Shield Discipline instead of Spell Wall, but realistically you can go with either morph. So for your flex spots here, so you have three flex spots to play around with. You have this slot, and this slot, and you can kind of play around with where your skills are depending on where you're most comfortable. This is just the setup that I have here. So a couple of let's see, a couple of flex skills. You can have Choking Talons. Most boss enemies are going to be immune to the mobilization effect of Choking Talons. However, they will still be afflicted by minor maim, which reduces the damage done by 15%. So if you need to tank multiple enemies, for example, if you're tanking the Ads in Ozara, if you're tanking the Manticore in Serpent, if you're taking the bosses in VDSA, then having minor maim apply to all those enemies at once is going to be very useful. It is a fairly expensive skill. It's 4,000 Magicka, so do be mindful of when you're using Choking Talons. Reflective Plate or Dragonfire skill is another potential option here for a flex spot. This basically just reflects 4 projectiles for 6 seconds, so you basically take no damage from any sort of projectile moves while you have it up for 6 seconds. Pretty useful. I like Reflective Plate because it gives me minor ward, but DK tanks generally don't have problems hitting the resistance cap for spell resistance. So that's kind of a little bit of a bonus there. Again, it is kind of expensive, so you don't necessarily want to use it all the time, but it is a nice niche skill to have. Now, if you do have enemies that you need to interrupt, you might want to use Deep Breath. Deep Breath interrupts casting enemies, and it does affect more than one enemy, so you're able to basically use it and interrupt everybody who's casting around you within 8 meters, so that's very, very useful. It also does have a nice heal associated with it. It's more useful the more enemies you have around you, obviously, but the heal can come in pretty good. So it's pretty much about a 1k heal for every enemy you hit. So if you have 5 enemies, you're pretty much healing for about 5.5k, which isn't that bad of a heal for 4,000 Magicka, but you do kind of want to be mindful because it is 4,000 Magicka there. And it will definitely heal less than Green Dragonblood, so if you want that burst heal, go for Green Dragonblood instead. Let's see, what are the other options you have here? You could go with Immovable if you'd like, or Unstoppable. So this is going to be mostly useful if you have bosses that have knockback or disabling effects, basically anything that stuns you. So that'll give you immunity to that for 5 seconds. It's kind of up to you. It does use stamina instead, which kind of sucks because you want to maintain your stamina for blocking. So I don't recommend using Unstoppable or Removable Brute. However, it is an option. I just really don't recommend it because it uses up stamina. Elusiveness is another potential option here, which basically reduces your damage taken by 75%, and it also grants you immunity from those, disabling those binding effects there. The downside of using Elusive Mist is, one, it's kind of expensive. It's about 4.4k magicka when you have it fully leveled, and two, you can't be healed, and you don't have any magicka regen. So that's a really, really big thing there. So for example, if you use Vigor and then use Elusive Mist, you won't get those healing ticks from Vigor because you won't be able to be healed while you're in Mist form. So that's kind of the downside of using Elusive Mist. You kind of want to be careful with using Elusive Mist if you're going to be using it at all. Another thing too is that if you can't block while you're in Mist form, so those 75% damage reduction is actually taken from unblocked damage. So you might end up taking even more damage as opposed to if you just stood there and just blocked it. So that's something you want to consider there. Ring of Preservation is another potential skill to use. Again, I don't recommend using it because it uses so much stamina. You can see here it's 6.4k stamina, but it does give you minor protection, so it does reduce damage taken by 8%. So on fights where you think you're going to be able to sustain your stamina better, you'll be able to heavy attack more often, this is a potential skill you can use, but just be mindful of it because it does take a lot of stamina in order to cast. And I believe that's pretty much it for flex skills here. And yeah, so that's pretty much it for the flex skills that you can use there. Now moving on to champion points. There's 240 points to put across the 3 constellations. So starting off with our Thief CPs, I have 64 into Arcanist and 64 into Nasty. You can bump this up to 75 each for an additional 22 CP points, but that's kind of up to you if you want to do that for the additional 1%, because you do want to have a couple of points left over for Shadow Ward, which reduces the cost of blocks. So I have 56 into Shadow Ward. So that's something to be mindful of. You don't want to take out too many points from Shadow Ward in order to get up the additional 1% in Tenacity and Arcanist. So just be mindful. I would recommend getting at least 56 points into Shadow Ward for 20% block reduction. Then I have 20 into Tumbling and 20 into Warlord, so you could just take those points out and put them in here if you would like to get up to 75. Now for my blue CPs, this particular toon doubles my stamina DPS, so that's why I have a stamina DPS set up right now for my blue CPs. However, if I was going to go pure tank, this is what I would do. I'd put 100 points into Blessed, 100 points into Elfborn, and then that's pretty much it. You can pretty much put the rest of the points however you'd like. I'd actually probably put them somewhere into the Atronach just for the riposte passive there, so you do a little bit of additional damage there, but it's not absolutely necessary here. So that's where I would do 100, 100, and then put the other 40 into here so you get that riposte passive. Now for our red CPs, I like to take a one-size-fits-most approach, so basically I don't have to switch around my CPs too much between content running. However, you might need to swap around CPs depending on the specific content you're running for that night. So your CP distributions are definitely going to be different from DPS because you're going to be taking different amounts of damage. So just be mindful of that. So when your raid lead says this is the CP distribution that you want to use, remember that is for DPS. It's not necessarily going to be useful for you as a tank because you're going to be taking different damage from different sources. So I had 66 into Ironclad, 1 into Spell Shield, 34 into Thick Skin, 64 into Hardened Elemental Defender, and 11 into Bastion. You can put a couple more points into Bastion if you would like. It's kind of up to you if you want to increase the effectiveness of your damage shield or not. That's kind of something that you want to play around with. I only have 34 points into Thick Skin compared to Ironclad, mainly because a lot of damage over time effects can be cleansed by Purge, or you can just heal through it, so that's kind of why I don't have as many points into Thick Skin here. But you can move a couple of points from Hardened Elemental Defender. You can drop down to the next lowest jump point, which is, I believe, 56, and then kind of put those into Thick Skin to hit the jump points there. So you have 37, 40, 44, 48, and I believe 52 are the next couple of jump points under Thick Skin there. So now that we have talked about all the build stuff, let's talk about our rotation, or rather, let's talk about our strategy for staying alive. So it's really hard to explain without actually being in a fight itself where I have to self-sustain. I believe I do have a couple of videos where I'm using this build. For example, when I'm tanking the Manticores in the back of Sanctum Ophidia, so I'll see if I can kind of pull those up for you guys, kind of leave them down in the description below so you guys can get an idea of what I'm doing here. So basically what you want to do is you definitely want to maintain taunt on everything. So you definitely want to make sure you have taunt on everything. And the next thing you're going to want to make sure to have is always going to want to have Minor Maim from your Heroic Slash. That 15% reduction in damage dealt is pretty strong, so you just want to make sure to always have Heroic Slash up. So you have the Minor Maim as well as the Minor Heroism, so you're going to want to use Heroic Slash every 10 seconds or 9 seconds to get that Minor Heroism buff, as well as maintain that Minor Maim. And of course you want to make sure you're taunting in order to, you know, keep taunt on whatever it is you have to tank at the time. Now the next thing that you're going to want to try to be mindful of is you're going to want to be mindful of your Igneous Shields. Now you will get 3 ultimate every 6 seconds, so basically that's the duration of Igneous Shields. So so you want to spam Igneous Shields if you're running low on stamina. So for example, let's say you're down to like here in stamina. You might want to spam Igneous Shields in order to get your stamina back, but generally speaking you're going to want to kind of stagger your Igneous Shields every 6 seconds, so you're making the most out of that ultimate generation also, so you're not unnecessarily wasting magicka. So when you're using Igneous Shields, you're either going to be using it for the ultimate regen every 6 seconds, or you're going to be using it before a big hit, so you aren't taking as much damage to your health. Your shield's going to be taking a good portion of it. So as we can see here, we have a 14k shield with Igneous. You will want to swap over to your back bar every once in a while. This is where our heals are. So if you do need to do a heal, I would recommend doing Igneous, swap to back bar, and use Green Dragon Blood. You do get major mending for 2.5 seconds after you use Igneous, so that's enough time for you to pop it, swap over, and use something like a Vigor or Green Dragon Blood. It's kind of up to you which one you want to do. You can also put one of those 2 healing skills on your front bar, so you would just do like Igneous Shield and then just use your healing ability. Now there is some debate as to whether to maintain your Green Dragon Blood, because you do get Minor Vitality, which increases the amount of healing you do to yourself by 8%, as well as it gives you Major Fortitude, which increases your health regen. But that's kind of up to you. It is a fairly expensive skill to maintain, but you only need to cast it every 22 seconds, so it's kind of up to you. I like to, the amount of times that you're using it in a fight, you typically will have it up almost 100% of the time, so it's not going to be absolutely necessary, but it is something that you want to kind of be mindful of, so just be mindful of that. So when it comes to solo sustain, I try to not overheal, so I don't try to heal until I'm about 60% health or so. Around 60% health, that's going to be when I want to use Green Dragon Blood, because again, Green Dragon Blood heals you for a percentage of the missing health, so the more health you have missing, the bigger your heal from Green Dragon Blood is. So I generally want to avoid using Green Dragon Blood until I hit around 60 to 50% health, somewhere below that range. From there on out, if I'm like above that threshold, I would typically use something like Vigor instead. You will definitely need to heavy attack every once in a while, so try to find openings to heavy attack. It is going to be very difficult when you're first learning these different fights to figure out the openings for heavy attacks, but once you get the hang of it, it'll be a lot easier to sustain your stamina that way. I like to pop Magma Shell whenever I get it up. However, sometimes I will save it up for when my health becomes a lot lower. So that's kind of up to you if you want to do that or not. You can pop it right when you need it, or you can just pop it right when it pops up. It's kind of plays up to you. So for example, in the ads against Ozara, because I'm taking so much damage from all those different ads, I will typically pop it right when I need it. Same thing for the Serpent in SO, but for some other fights, for example, if I'm tanking St. Olms in Vet Asylum, I'll actually save up my Magma Shell until I absolutely need it. So that's basically with, I'm getting hit by Defiling Blast when there's a Storm of the Heavens happening, that's when I'll save up and use my Magma Shell. If you do need the resources right away and you can't, or you don't feel comfortable enough to save up your ultimate for Magma Shell, then you can use the Shield Ultimate instead, the one-handed Shield Ultimate on your back bar instead. That'll basically let you do basically do whatever you want for 6 seconds because you have your permanent block up. So it'll give you a chance to basically heavy attack, to use balance if you need to, because you're just constantly blocking, or to get your resources back. But it's not going to return as many resources because it's not doesn't cost as much ultimate as Magma Shell does, but it is nice for that emergency, I need resources now and I can't wait for Magma Shell to be up. So just be mindful of that. So if I'm dipping below around 20 to 30% Magicka and Stamina, and I don't have Magma Shell up yet, I will use Shield Wall, but that's kind of also dependent on the fight. So for example, in against the Manticore and Serpent in SO, I always try to save Magma Shell for those poison phase because I won't be in range of a healer, so I need that Magma Shell in order to survive poison phase. So that's something you want to keep in mind as well. So that's it for this video. I hope you guys found it informative. So I will try to find an example of when I'm solo tanking, and I'll try to put that down in the description below. I'm pretty sure I have a couple of examples from the Manticore and SO, solo tanking the ads and Ozara and things like that. So I'll put those down in the description below. So I hope you guys found this video informative. I will see you guys in the next dungeon.